Hello and welcome back to the Microlearning Institute. In this tutorial we look at the concept of risk management, particularly as applied to project management. Risk management is defined as being the systematic application of management policies, procedures and practices to identify, analyze, manage and communicate risks. Now that definition contains quite a lot. First of all, it's systematic. Systematic meaning that it is a process that occurs regularly and reliably within the organization. Systematic does not mean that it's a once-off event that happens at the start of the project or once in the middle of the project. Systematic means it happens regularly and robustly. Similarly, the words policies, procedures and practices are important. So again, this is that the organization needs to have policies as to what their approach to risk management is and what their appetite for risk is. They need to have procedures in place as to how to conduct a risk management. And also they need to have practices in place where people have the skills needed in order to deliver risk management effectively to the organization. But the final element of this definition that's important is the idea of the phases of risk management. So phase 1 is where we identify the risk. Phase 2 is where we analyze the risk. Phase 3 is we determine how to manage each risk. And phase 4 is how we communicate those risks across the organization. So let's have a look at each of the phases. Phase 1 is where we identify the risk. And again, it's important to say that the benefits of risk management are only as good as the identification of the risk. So again, we need to spend the time necessary to identify potential risks. Also, we need to involve the people that are necessary in order to identify these risks. So again, some risks are very technical in nature. So for example, financial risks can perhaps only best be identified by the finance staff, whereas IT risks can only be identified by the IT staff and so on. So it's important that we have a robust process that works consistently across all parts of the organization so that we're confident that all of the risks of the organization are being adequately identified. The next thing that we need to do is we need to analyze the risk. Now, risk analysis involves considering two particular characteristics of each risk that we have identified. The first characteristic is the probability of that risk, i.e., how likely is this risk to materialize. And again, we can take a scale between low and high. Now again, more formal risk processes will define what is meant by low. Is it less than 1 in a million events? Is it less than once per week or once per year? And similarly, we'll define what's meant by high. Now, the other characteristic of risk that we need to analyze is the impact of that risk. And again, similarly, we can consider whether the impact is low or high. So all of the risks that we've identified in the risk identification phase now need to be mapped onto this matrix, and we can use our judgment, depending on we can use our historic knowledge, we can benchmark against other organizations, we can use judgments, we can use some calculations, we can use statistical techniques to help us map all of the risks that we've identified onto this 2x2 matrix. Now, the risks that we'll be concerned about then will depend upon our risk appetite, and we can well imagine that different companies and different projects may warrant different appetites for risk. Typically the tech sector is perceived as being very high risk, whereas maybe the pharma sector or the airline sector or the nuclear sector would be characterized as being very, very low risk. So we need to decide where is our risk appetite and above what threshold do we become very concerned about a particular risk. So this is the analysis phase of the risk management process. Next up, we need to decide how are we going to manage each risk. And again, there's a mnemonic here, it's TARA, so it helps us to think, are we going to transfer each risk or a particular risk? Transfer could mean that we might insure the risk so that if the risk does materialize, that we can transfer the cost of that risk to an outside insurer. Or perhaps we might outsource a particular task to make sure that somebody who has the right skills is delivering the task, and consequently the risk is going to be reduced. Another strategy that we could adopt to managing the risk is we could simply accept the risk. So if a particular risk, if the probability and the impact of that risk are within our risk appetite, we may, as an organization, choose to accept that risk and to take the view that being in this particular business means that we are going to have to accept this risk. Another strategy that we could adopt in order to manage risk is we could take a step to reduce a risk. So we could put a control in place that helps to reduce the risk or helps to provide an early warning of the risk materializing so that we can take action and reduce the impact of that risk. Of course, a final strategy that we could take in terms of managing risk is we could choose to avoid the risk. So in the context of project management, for example, that would mean that we might change the scope of the project to ensure that the scope of the project didn't expose the organization to that particular risk, thus choosing to avoid the likelihood of that risk materializing. Finally, we need to determine how to communicate that risk. And again, within the process of risk management, we have the concept of a risk register. And a risk register is simply a document or a database where we store information about our risks. So we store our assessment of what each individual risk, what the probability of that risk is and how we determine that probability, what the impact of the risk is and how we determine that impact, what mitigation strategies we have taken in regard to that risk, and what action was required in order to execute those mitigation strategies. Now, this risk register is a source of knowledge management within the organization because, of course, if one project develops a risk register, when a similar project is being delivered subsequently, the project manager for the subsequent project can leverage the knowledge that was collected in the initial risk register to ensure that the organization isn't continuously exposed to the same risks. Thank you very much for watching this short tutorial from the Microlearning Institute on the concept of risk management as applied to project management.